everybody. Welcome to another session of Facebook Live. I am Patty Dorito, the owner and founder of Holistic Healing Atlanta. At Holistic Healing Atlanta, we incorporate healing the mind through traditional therapy and something called quantum neuro reset therapy, where we balance the brain and address past traumas that are still affecting us. And also, I have added neurofeedback. We also address the body, healing that, where we address nutrition and sleep and de-stressing ourselves, balancing our genetics through holistic methylation, and then the spiritual, the soul. Now, each person comes to us with a unique set of issues, and therefore no two protocols are going to be the same. I know personally that when I address the body, the mind, and the soul, I'm a much more balanced person. I see it like a three-legged stool. When all three legs are strong and working, the stool is sturdy and solid. If one leg is missing, now we're sort of teetering back and forth, a little bit wobbly. And if there's only if one leg standing and two are missing, we have a lot of difficulty trying to manage life. So about 22 years ago, I went into a very deep, dark depression, and you can read more about that on my website at Holistic Healing Atlanta. And I was barely functioning. At the time, I was pumped full of pharmaceuticals that were prescribed and got no relief. Actually, I only got worse. And I really do believe that the drugs were causing the symptoms of depression. Anyway, the leg of the mind, how I was feeling, was missing. Much of the physical parts of my body, mind, and soul was missing. And I only had one leg left, and that was the soul. And I can't describe that dark, dark hole, what it felt like, but I knew the only thing that I could hang on to was my faith. I knew that God loved me despite the suffering, but I did yell at God more than once. And there was a verse in the New Testament of the Bible that kind of kept on coming back to me. It's from John 15. And Jesus says that he takes away branches so that does not bear fruit, and he prunes them. And it hurt. That pruning hurt a lot. And that's hurt caused a lot of suffering. And through suffering, there was a lot of loneliness and isolation. And now I think about all the suffering people are going through and the isolation. It's like unprecedented amounts of anxiety and depression, and it's crushing us. But there's another verse that I also very much clung to. It's John 15:5. I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So that was something that I could very much visualize. It kept me alive, literally, in my darkest moments. And because that worked for me, that soul part of me addressing it when nothing else was working, I feel very strongly about putting that into treating and working with people in the three-prong approach. So tonight, the topic is the three prongs of health. What does the soul have to do with it? So what does the soul have to do with health? What's the relationship between the body, mind, and soul? And where do we start if this is a new concept, or we're just rusty? So tonight, I have a very special guest, Father Michael Bremer. Father Michael was born in Germany and raised overseas most of his life in a military family. He attended the University of Georgia and then went right into the seminary afterwards. He was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Atlanta in 2018 and has been serving at St. Bridget Catholic Church in Johns Creek, Georgia since 2019. Please welcome Father Michael.
Hello.
Well, thanks for coming on board with me.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's just start a little bit about you. How did you find your way to God?
Yeah, so my experience of religion started when I was an infant, right? I got baptized by my family. And so what it looked like, though, growing up was basically being dragged to church by my mom. But it wasn't until, what's that?
Go, mom.
Yeah, I know, mom power. Yeah. But it wasn't until I got to college, my mom actually signed my sister and I up for a mission trip, and so we went to this place called Lourdes, France. What I realized that I saw there was what I realized I was missing my entire life: peace and joy. So I said a little prayer there saying, okay, if this whole God thing is real, show me that you exist. And no joke, the very next morning, all of a sudden, boom, it just like grace just hit me. And all of a sudden I realized, okay, God exists, but because he answered my prayer, he also knows that I exist. So in a very real way, I began to see God, and I know at that moment that he saw me. So at that point, I realized, okay, if this whole God thing is real, then my life really has to change. And so it's kind of been a history ever since.
There you go. One thing led to the next, and look at you now. So let's just start with, what is the soul? How would you describe the soul? Because that can be a hard question for people to grasp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's actually going to be a common theme as we're talking through a lot of these different things. There's a lot of different definitions we have for a lot of these realities we try and describe. To try and keep it simple, though, and keep it relevant for our lives. So very clearly, as you were kind of implying, like we as humans aren't just one dimensional, right? There's these different dimensions that we have. So in a very real way, in the classical tradition, what we come to understand is that we humans are a composite of both body and soul. So what we believe the soul to be, or at least one of the different definitions we can say, it comes from the Latin anima, which, as you can probably guess, the English animate. And so what we see is that the anima, the soul, is the vitality, is the dynamic of life, is the principle of life within our existence. So the soul gives life to the mind, but it also gives life to the body. It's probably like the simplest way to describe it.
Okay, well, thank you. And what is the difference, as you see it, between the soul and maybe the spirit?
Yeah, so again, we're talking about different definitions.
Right.
Yeah, so again, in the classical tradition, which is I'm a little bit biased with the classical tradition, but so when we talk about soul as a like a vital principle, what we come to recognize is that, well, plants in a certain, again, if we're using this very base technical definition, we come to recognize that plants have a soul, right? They have a vital aspect of life that you're not able to dissect under a microscope, right? There's a principle of life operating within it that tries to like nourish itself. When we look at animals, for instance, they also have this nutritive soul, but they also have a locomotive soul, right? This dynamic of life. But when we get to humans, though, what we do see is a pretty profound difference between plants, animals, and humans. And so when we talk about the spirit, maybe one of the ways that we can kind of view that is maybe consciousness, or maybe, I don't know how, when you all had the component of mind, maybe it might be a very similar concept to that. So the spirit is a specific type of soul. If that kind of makes sense. I don't know.
Getting deep.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we're getting into the weeds big time already. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, like, let me just ask you this question, because then on a more practical level, how do we nourish or pay attention to the soul and as part of the three prongs of health? How do you see that as a man of the cloth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very similar to how you were describing there in the intro, right? Take, for instance, like if it's kind of like a cloudy, miserable kind of day, like our spirit, right? Our soul kind of sinks, right? Our mind might go towards like negativity, or I think of like maybe like a migraine or some type of like bodily ache. Like a very like bodily physical thing has the power to influence our minds and our soul, but it's also vice versa too, right? Like all of a sudden, if I receive something like a really wonderful compliment, right, it's a spiritual, untangible thing, like all of a sudden my body also might start to kind of relax to that, right? So what we see is that there's like an up and down that, from like the concrete, tangible, bodily to the upper realm of like the spiritual, that there's a give and take that kind of reacts in between this.
Yeah, and kind of like what I said in the intro, that like if our leg hurts because we injured it, it affects how we feel and how we perceive things, and maybe it's a little bit harder to go into prayer.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Or, if we're just feeling, like you said, a gloomy day, then I just know after I played softball in college. And if we lost the game, everybody was like hurt more and everyone was like down. But if we won, who cared about the stuff? And that's that body mind connect.
Exactly. So they all have a role to play with each other.
Right. So I think addressing the soul, I mean, the concrete way to access is through prayer. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one of the things that's really important too in today's world is that we are so busy, and we have this thing here that people are so connected to it that they forget to be quiet and to be still. And until we are doing that, I don't think we can really pray,
No.
But why do you say why pray? What is that?
Sorry, go ahead.
Why do you say why pray? We're talking to somebody.
Yeah, so first of all, what we understand to be prayer, right, is some kind of, like, again, there's a lot of different ways to define prayer. Again, surprise, common theme. But probably the most general, the most like vague, sort of like broad way to describe it is an encounter with the divine. An encounter with the divine. Again, like people have written about prayer, so I don't know, to sum it up is a little bit pretentious, but whatever, we're going with it. So then when we talk about why prayer, so the first kind of thing is if God exists, like if there's such thing as the divine, like by the mere fact of the divine being infinite, being all powerful, being all loving, being all knowing, being all present, like by the very fact that there's a perfect being, it demands justice, right? That proper praise, that its proper due is given. That's kind of like the first kind of initial one. But why pray? Well, first of all, because prayer not only allows us to give glory to God, but it also has a very real way of impacting us, right? And it's probably the more relevant topic to be talking about here, right? So kind of the example I love to use when it comes to an encounter with the divine is there's obviously a ton of them in the Bible, but I think of Genesis 32, where Jacob is wrestling with God. Patty, do you remember that one? Yeah, so all of a sudden he finds himself wrestling with this divine being. And it's really beautiful because what we see is that when the divine enters into our life, the divine, in a certain sense, limits itself by, and it's speaking with the human language, interacting with humans, right? There's a certain limit imposed upon itself. Because in the story, Jacob himself binds this divine being and the being can't escape. At the same time, Jacob also can't escape. So Jacob says to this being, hey, give me your blessing and then I'll let you go. And the being says, okay, but your life will never be the same. And that's a really beautiful aspect of it. But it can be kind of intimidating because at that point, the being knocks his hip joint out of his leg. And so he has to walk around with a limp the rest of his life. Hopefully that's not a terrifying image. Hopefully it's just kind of like pointing at this reality that, yeah, we'll kind of never be the same after a real encounter with the divine, whether that's to a small degree or to a large degree.
Yeah, when you were speaking about that, I was sort of wondering, like you had a moment of the divine when you were in Lourdes, France. Mm-hmm. How did you then make that concrete to actually say, going from sort of zero to trying to have some kind of quiet, some kind of prayer, some kind of encounter with the divine? How did you do that?
Yeah, so one of the big components that I personally believe that when it comes to prayer is that it's never our motivation, right? It's never our doing, it's never our desire, right? It gets planted into us by the divine, right? We know that all good things come from God, including prayer. So when I decided to pray that prayer, is ultimately the Lord really provoking my heart of saying, hey, see this peace, see this joy, desire that. And to a certain extent, I cooperated with that and said, all right, I desire that. But then at that point, it's just kind of like riding the wave of grace. So I look to my mom as like a really concrete, tangible example of what like authentic piety is. She's Polish, so you get a strong piety there. Yeah, oh my gosh. I also neglected a lot of my college work because I was so excited about Catholicism and like learning in the faith that I just did a ton of research and just stumbled across this reality of prayer. And so I read blogs, I read books, read a whole ton of different stuff. And after various experiences of like different writers saying, hey, this is how you pray, what I came to recognize is that the Lord was inviting me deeper and deeper into a prayer life.
Cool. I think sometimes in prayer, people use God as a fire extinguisher. I have this problem. I need you, God. And then when everything's kind of calm, and then they're like, got it, thanks. So, even like incorporating the different types of prayers. So, there's prayers of petition, which there's nothing wrong, because, it says when two or three are gathered in my name, so it gives that. But there's also, adoring the Lord. There's there's all sorts of those different aspects of the prayer. And, how does somebody know they're praying right?
So I think probably the simplest way to answer that is if you're being honest, you're doing it right. Because I think probably the instinct, like when it comes between like the human divine relationship, is to kind of I don't know, be timid maybe, and to maybe say like, oh well, God doesn't want to hear me, complain about this, or for me to complain about that. But it's like, no, like prayer is that authentic honesty, because like when we open up those places of darkness within our own hearts, like that's when the divine gets wild, right? That's when the divine becomes untamed, and that's when the divine can actually start working in our life. It's kind of interesting. You talked about God as a fire extinguisher, or maybe like a ATM machine sometimes, right? But what I tell people is that you shouldn't learn how to pray whenever you don't need, but rather you should always recognize that at every single moment of your life, you are constantly needing. So Luigi Giussani, he's a theologian in the 20th century. He says, the protagonist of all of history is the beggar, right? Not the politician, not the emperor, not like a celebrity, not an entertainer. The protagonist of all of history is the beggar. Man who begs for God, and Christ who begs for man's heart. And so it kind of points to this reality that even in the good times in my life, like I still really need God. Yeah, even when things are going well, even when things like God has answered all my prayers, right? I still need Him, and so that kind of keeps us in tune with recognizing that, yeah, the divine is always here for us.
Yeah. And I do think that it's a human tendency when things are going well is to sort of put God back on that back burner, unless the person decides proactively every single day that I'm going to make room for God. And I know if I start my day with prayer, it just seems to go by a little easier than, less frustration, less like whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And so that kind of gets into like what exactly like the fruits of prayer is. So I really love this quote by Mother Teresa. She says, the fruit of silence is prayer. Right. So that's kind of like we were talking about earlier, like with all these distractions, like until we learn how to detach from them and yeah, and really allow the science or the silence to really like permeate our hearts, like then prayer can happen. Then she goes on to say the fruit of prayer is faith, right? So when we pray, we receive a greater faith. When we receive a greater faith, well, then we receive a greater love. And then so on and so forth. And then finally, the fruit of love is service, and the fruit of service is peace. And so, yeah, it's just a really profound reality. So kind of maybe a sort of like a different angle to look at that. So St. Paul, yeah, there it is on the screen. I love that quote. I love that quote. It's so true, right? So silence, prayer, faith, love, service, peace. Right. So Paul in the letter to the Galatians, he says the fruits of well, he says the Holy Spirit, but it can be equally true. Like the fruits of prayer can be charity, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, generosity, gentleness, faithfulness, modesty, self-control, chastity. Because when we look at like what your job is, in a very real way, like you're here to empower people. That in certain areas of their life, they actually do have more control than they realize. But there's also areas of our lives that we don't have control over, right? There's areas within our being that we need. And so in a very real way, that the divine has the power to be able to give us these very things. And maybe there's one of these things that maybe one of our viewers is really lacking. And so, wow, I really need to pray for that. Some gentleness, some faithfulness. And so, yeah, so the divine has an incredible power to work in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that sometimes instead of me, asking for, to heal this person or to help this marriage or whatever. It's really training me to sit with more silence, so I could have the fruit of these things. That I can't control what's out there, but I can start asking God to help mold the inside of me to have these great things that, if we all live that a little bit more, make my job a lot easier.
In general, the world would be a better place.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you, like, what is the role or the purpose of suffering? Because we talked about, I don't know. I know that I have suffered with that depression. It's something I would never wish on my worst enemy, but it's something also that I'm kind of glad it happened, because it made me a better person. I got pruned, and I can remember saying, "Okay, God, are you done chopping me up?" But no, he wasn't. But to see, like, how do you see what would you tell somebody? What is the purpose of suffering? Because everybody suffers, big and little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think like, and you're kind of chatting about that when you're giving like a little introduction, when you invited people to go on your website to read more about kind of like your history, right? So suffering is kind of ironic in the sense that every single one of us go through it, but our suffering is always going to be particular to each and every one of us, right? So if I go through some type of like dysfunctional like family dynamic and somebody else is going through almost the exact same thing, like our reaction, our coping, like how we live the rest of our lives is going to be different, right? So suffering is particular to each and every one of us. So that also means that the purpose of suffering is particular to each and every one of us. When I think of this question, what's the purpose of suffering? I think a lot of the book of Job, right, which I'm sure, Patty, you're familiar with, and maybe many of our viewers are as well. So Job is a morally outstanding man, and so God kind of brags about him, and then so you have a devil's advocate come and say, well, the only reason you're bragging about him is because you've blessed him. And G.K. Chesterton, he has this really wonderful introduction into the life of Job, and he says there's a lot of questions that get provoked from the book of Job, and so that's where you get one of his famous lines from G.K. Chesterton, who says, "The questions of God are more satisfying than the answers of men." Because, for instance, I mean, just to make a long story short, one of the things that the book of Job is specifically questioning is, do I suffer because I've sinned? Conversely, is my life good because I've done well? Because that was a prevailing notion in Jewish theological, philosophical thought at the time. But by posing the question, maybe we answer, no, maybe it's not because I was morally wrong that I'm suffering, right? And then so I think probably the most intriguing question that Job, that the book of Job provokes is, well, how does God feel about my suffering? Right? How does God feel about my suffering? Because that's ultimately how we understand the purpose of it. Because it's true, right? To know that everything that happens, good or bad, is within the scope of divine providence. So literally everything has a purpose, but it becomes kind of trite and dismissive, right, towards people who might be experiencing incredible suffering. But when the divine says, "Hey, here's the reason why you're going through this," like all of a sudden, like we kind of do like Job. It's like, okay, I'm done talking. So, I mean, is it okay if I just share an experience when I was going through some suffering and how God revealed? Okay. Yeah. So in 2016, I worked as a hospital chaplain at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. So as a chaplain, we obviously minister to people's soul. They're in the hospital. And we got this question a lot from kids. Like, it's just something instinctual in the maturing mind to say, like, I must have done something wrong because I'm suffering, right? And so our role is to kind of allow people to like experience that and to like just go through their own maturation. But one particular, so every now and then we do an overnight just to kind of be there for like emergency purposes. And one of the evenings, I went through an incredibly traumatic experience for myself, but I couldn't even imagine for these parents, right? So there was a child who was just born and it wasn't looking good. So I was invited in that moment to go and baptize the child. The parents eventually got there, and it was an incredibly tender, beautiful moment, but it was incredibly traumatizing. Just like the fear of like a kid, right? Hours old, the possibility of death. And so it is, again, I couldn't imagine like for like how fearful they were, but just for myself, right? And so what I came to recognize is, like in my prayer, there's just a lot of bitterness and resentment towards God. Like, how could you allow this to happen to me? Like, I'm here trying to help people, and you're putting me in situations that are impossible, that are so difficult. And the question was like, where were you in the midst of this? And after about a week of just like shaking my fist at God, I heard a silent, gentle. I just got this very gentle sense. Yeah, I was in you. Like ministering to this family, because it was incredibly profound for them.
Wow.
They're incredibly grateful. Yeah, so in a particular way, like the Lord at that time revealed to me, like, hey, this is the purpose of why you went through this, right? To be a kind of like living reality for this family kind of going through it.
Yeah, yeah. I know even like in the depth of that depression, I didn't, I felt like I was all alone. God was, I kind of knew he was there. I didn't doubt that, but I didn't realize that when I was on the other side of it, that the Lord really had me in the palm of his hands. And it could make me cry just thinking just how tender he was. And he never abandoned me, even though I felt that loneliness and that isolation. I mean, so yeah. And I just know when people suffer, what does Fred Rogers say? Look for the good people, or look for I don't remember if did you ever watch Mr. Rogers?
No.
Yeah. Anyway, it was something like look for the good person in the midst of it. What you were just talking about is this family going through this horrific thing, and here's this person who's ministering God to them, addressing their worst nightmare, and reassuring just by you showing up. So, but I mean, you were traumatized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted, like, if somebody doesn't really have a spiritual component in their life, like, how does that affect the mind and the body? And then eventually I'll ask you this question, like, well, what do they do? If they want to start incorporating in that. But just like, if I don't have the spiritual, can I be a happy, well-adjusted person?
Probably the best case scenario is possibly. Because I don't know, there's a lot of different ways we can kind of phrase that. You can kind of view it as maybe like three different plants kind of growing like intermingled with each other. Like if one of those plants at the base isn't receiving water, then it's gonna like just completely like wither away, right? Kind of like the analogy you're using in John 15. So again, if we believe that there are these various components to our existence, mind, body, soul, then if I'm not nurturing it, then yeah, there's going to be something big missing in my life. Yeah, and so the place to start, this might be maybe the few of the books I recommend towards the end, but kind of the place to start is just where you're at. So in the Christian tradition, what we do is when we look at the reality of God and his desire to save humanity, we see the first dynamic of God loving us where we're at. And then the second dynamic is taking us where we can't get to. There's a priest, his name is Father Mike Schmitz. He says, God loves us where we're at, but loves us too much to keep us there. So again, prayer kind of goes back to that honesty. Yeah, exactly. So prayer begins with that honesty. But so some I don't know, super like tangible, like concrete ways to begin prayer is you have to carve out not necessarily a quantity of time, but a quality of time. So that means silence, right? That means either not even having your phone in the same room, or putting on an airplane mode, or optimistically at best, putting it on silence. But so that's one of the biggest things. But and that takes practice. Right, Blaise Pascal, way back in I think in the 18th century, he said all of modern man's qualms, all of his problems, are because of the fact that he can't sit still alone in a quiet room.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. And that's in the 18th century, right? He is the 21st. So that's a really practical thing. It takes practice, both on a bodily level, just like all the sensory stimuli we have kind of going throughout about our day. It takes practice, but then it even takes practice to quiet the mind and then to quiet the soul. So there's also like, yeah, tangible, concrete, quiet silence, but also just like the consistency of perseverance in prayer as well. Um, you were kind of mentioning a lot of different types of prayer. So, for example, in the Catholic tradition, we have what's called the Rosary. It's an out loud sort of vocal kind of prayer while you're meditating, and I know that's helpful for a lot of people. There's various other ways that we do that as well. Some people prefer like a type of contemplation where it's just simply them looking at God, looking at them, right? So silence, perseverance, and then the type of prayer that you're being invited to. If one of these different modes of prayer doesn't work, then maybe try a different one. But don't try too quickly, because again, like all these things take practice. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think that's probably enough for a starter.
Yeah, I think it's also having realistic expectations. So if I'm going to run a marathon, I'm not going to expect on my first day out that I'm going to go run 15 miles.
Yeah.
Or that I'm going to run a 5-minute mile, sprint it out there. And it's just like, this is the long haul. And what do I have to do to get in shape? I know you work out and stuff. And I also say, like, prayers like eating. If you just pray once a week when you go to your church on Sunday, well, that'd be like eating once a week. We're not going to like it too much, but to be gentle with yourselves and understanding. I think, like, sometimes I get spiritually ADD. And my brain's like all over the place, and that's where I have a journal. And so I will I'll write down something like, Lord, how do you see me? And I'll just start writing, and it's my prayer. It's my prayer time. And so, yeah, if I can't get into a church, because I pray better in a church, I have my back patio in the summer, which I love because I could hear the birds, and I just start. I listen to the birds. I look at the light coming through the trees. So I'm just quieting myself, and then I can move into prayer. So
yeah. There's something about the environment that makes prayer more conducive for certain people versus others. So yeah, there's sort of a lot to try out, a lot of different variables.
Right. And if people can't pray at home, and I'm not too good because I get distracted, people can go for a walk, like a meditative kind of walk. But yeah. So I think that's, just like you said, figuring out what works for you at that time. And we mature. So what works now and maybe in a year it'll be different. And there are all sorts of good books on prayer that people can read, or, I mean, you could even just Google how to pray well, or, yeah, I just think it's a lot of stuff like that. So something I was just wondering too, how do you see, this is switching subject a little bit, when people say, well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, how do you see the difference of that? And, because I know it doesn't matter what faith someone came from, there's a lot of spiritual abuse or spiritual hurts that people have encountered. And so I'm not going to ever beat somebody over the head and say, God's gonna, but I don't know. So how do you address when someone says, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual?
I say, well, I'm not spiritual, but religious, so we should hang out. Just kidding. Yeah, I always ask people to kind of like expound upon that, not because I doubt them, but because like I just have a hard time like understanding like what exactly that means. Because like if we're kind of going from this perspective that like the body and soul have such a like profound connection, right? It's not just like the spirit, like the soul is just like kind of inhabiting this like machine. It's like, no, there's like, it's such a beautiful union that happens between. It's like, I don't know how you can be spiritual without being religious, right? Again, it kind of maybe depends on how we define those terms. Like maybe a person might not go to church, right? But at the very least, like they have to at least close their eyes. And for me, that's being religious, because maybe the religious is kind of like the down to earth, concrete, like human things that we do. And then the spiritual is kind of like what like raises our spirit, our mind to God. And so like for me, it's just so tough to kind of separate the two because we are incarnational beings. And so I just kind of like, yeah, I'm not really sure, how you can be one without the other.
Yeah, I do think you're right when people say I'm spiritual, not religious. I think they say I don't want to go to an institution. I don't want to go to a church. I don't want to belong to a denomination. You know, they have their own reasons and stuff. So
Yeah, yeah, okay. And so that's maybe a little bit more specific of like this question going on. Yeah, and to that, again, we kind of go back to this recognition that I am constantly in need. Like I'm beloved, right? I am by my mere existence, I'm good and a blessing to people. But at the same time, I'm also in need. And so I'm sure we've all heard that parable before of like there's a flood coming in, but a guy's like, oh, I'm just going to pray to God, right? And then like the army comes in, the Navy comes in, the Air Force comes in to try and save him, but he's like, no, I'm going to rely on God. But then like the floods sweep him away, and he gets to heaven. He's like, God, where were you? And it's like, I sent you all these things, because it's just part of the human reality that we need others to help us out on this journey. Again, if there's skepticism, if there's doubt that happens within a religious institution, then that's totally understandable. Religious institutions don't have the best track record in the world. So it's understandable, but at the very least, we do need other people to help us out in this journey. We Christians believe that God is incredibly tangible in Jesus Christ, right, who has become human, like every single one of us. But every now and then, that's not very perceptible. And so in a very real way, like in order for me to be nourished in my soul, like I do just need to talk to somebody sometimes, right? Especially when God isn't necessarily being perceptible. So that's kind of what I would say to that. I totally get it. It's understandable, like why someone would be very skeptical of a religious institution.
yeah, that part about needing people when the church is all shut down. Now we have to go to the services online, and I'm not a service online kind of girl. That was hard. But the first time we went back, it was actually for confession. It was like a person. And it just felt really good to be around another person besides my dear husband.
It's true. It's so true.
Yeah, and I do think that because we're human in nature, that we're social and we're made to be in community, and I think that's the benefit of a church community, of having that. Because when I'm falling down, somebody's there saying, "Hey, I'm here with you." And I had some very dear Christian friends that really helped me in that time of darkness.
Yeah, and in a very real way, you're helping others, right? So it's mutual, right?
Yeah. So, and that's one of the reasons I said, when I get better, I know it's like to be depressed, and I know, and I just had some weird therapists and stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm going to incorporate the best practices of psychology with my faith, and I'm going to be good, because I know what not so good is. So, Father Michael, do you have any resources that you would recommend for people that they can start with? First of all, I think just opening up the New Testament or the Psalms is a really good place also. But if you want a little bit more direction.
Exactly. I love that you brought up the Psalms, and Proverbs as well. Because the Psalms have every kind of type of prayer, right? There's lament, there's anger towards God, which is, again, totally okay, as long as we're receptive to what he has to respond back with. There's lament, anger, but there's also praise, thanksgiving, blessing, adoration.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me, because I couldn't remember all those.
Intercession, petition, right? The five prayer. Like all those are present in the Psalms, and so they give us a vocabulary, they give us a spirit, so to speak, to be able to pray. So Psalms, Proverbs. There's a ton of books, there's a ton of online resources, but one of the ones that had a severe impact on me is this prayer. It's by Hans von Balthasar. And essentially that's kind of what you were getting at there in the New Testament. Because what we see is that there's a lot of different ways to phrase the Bible, right? We call it God's rescue plan. But I think probably the best way to describe it is God's speaking to man, right? The divine speaking to mankind. And so what we see in a very particular way is that in Jesus Christ, right, God made man, right, when God becomes human, that he doesn't just speak Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek, right? in that moment, he also speaks by becoming pierceable, right? His heart can actually break now. And so what we see is that God is, is entering into relationship with man, and we see man's response to God. So this book kind of outlines that, like the concreteness of prayer, what to do with the Gospels, and then how that might lead us in a deeper relationship with God. Another really profound one is Contemplative Provocations by Father Donald Haggerty. And essentially, he's kind of approaching it from this reality that prayer is difficult, to say the least. Yeah, and so there's a lot of like paradoxes that he has in here. So this is more for like maybe like the mystical kind of mind. This is prayer is maybe more for the, like the concrete person. This is maybe more for like the mystical kind of mind. But he has a lot of different like things that you can kind of chew on that kind of like maybe directs your prayer in a certain direction. So these are some like the two books that I've really liked.
Cool. Do you have any other last kind of thoughts before we wrap up about the body, the mind, the soul, the three prongs of health?
Yeah. So in every single type of benefit, there's always a risk we take, right? Because I can live a mediocre existence, just like living by myself and keeping myself safe. But it takes a level of vulnerability to feel fulfilled, right? So for example, like if I haven't worked out at all in my life, going to the gym is incredibly a vulnerable experience, right? I might get made fun of or whatever. But like me stepping out and taking that risk shows sign of improvement. Same thing with going to see a therapist. And so it becomes a very similar reality in prayer, right? And so there's a lot of different questions. For example, if I show God my heart and my soul, is he going to like what he finds? Right. And so it takes a level, like just by that question itself, like it just shows like prayer takes a level of vulnerability. And so by that, it takes a risk. And so I can keep my soul closed off, or I can take a risk and find that fulfillment. So I think that, again, that's kind of like the like one of the key takeaways from prayer is like that vulnerability and that honesty.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I incorporate faith and religion into my practice is, I meet people where they are. So, some people say they don't want to talk about it, but I'm actually trying to, because as we find God, as we find ourselves, we can also find God. So I also want to say, like, I'm almost like a mirror of God to them, so they can reflect and see how God sees them. That's kind of how I see it. And most people will say, God loves everybody except me. I'm faulted, I'm flawed. I mean, that's pretty universal, that people feel that they're unlovable. And it's so trying to help them to see that they are loved by God, not because they did anything. Like me, I grew up being a human doer. And so, that's how I got, one of 8 kids, got attention, is to do and to achieve. And I have a very talented family, and I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. So that it was really hard for me to now learn to be. And that's one of the things I tell people: you're a human being, not a human doer. And that you don't have to do anything to be lovable. And that's a really hard concept for people to, even sometimes I fall into, like, I better do something here.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, or we're going to wrap up.
No, that's it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you being coming and spending time with us. So next week on the 27th, I have a program with Marta Cadenas. She is a oncologist, nutritionist, and it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And so I don't know if you know that 1 in 7 women in North America will develop breast cancer in their lifetime. So some of it's genetic, but our genes aren't our destiny. So I just think it's very cool that there's lots of things we can do to prevent us from it, whether it's breast cancer or any kind of cancer, because it's prevalent around. So I hope you tune in next week, and thank you for joining us. So good night.